Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we are talking about Silent Hill 3, the entry after the highly acclaimed Silent Hill 2 and a direct sequel to the very first Silent Hill. I already reviewed Silent Hill 2 recently in a very in-depth review, and I'm very proud of it, so make sure you also check that out if you want more Silent Hill goodness on the channel. For now, let's focus on the third entry, and if it succeeds in filling those large shoes that fans have been waiting for. The game was released in 2003, and we follow the story of Heather, an American teenager who keeps seeing these nightmarish beings invade her personal life in the town she lives in, eventually forcing her to make the choice of visiting Silent Hill directly. First off, let's talk graphics. This game looks absolutely gorgeous. Not only does it look great for a 2003 title, which was about the halfway mark for the PlayStation 2, but it's a great looking title and among the best looking PlayStation 2 games in general. Silent Hill 2 already had some really technical marvels to behold, including its really impressive dynamic lighting and shadows, but with Silent Hill 3, they throw it up a notch. Now, characters also have dynamic shadows being cast on their own skin, and even have self-created shadows, which is something not even all Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 characters had. Textures are way more crisp and clear than compared to Silent Hill 2, and the facial animations in the cutscenes are unreal. They look amazing, still even now. The character models and art direction just also is really pretty, with Heather's look being really memorable. It's mostly the upflailing hair I always think about, and even in remakes of this character, like in a recent Dead by Daylight, the version of Heather is not the same and does not look as good as the PlayStation 2 title. It's really impressive. Also, one detail I noticed that not a lot of people seem to talk about with this game is that often it seems that the lip sync is very close to what the actual actors are saying. The presentation in this game is an absolute 10 and a pinnacle for what the PlayStation 2 could achieve. The music is also great, as often is when it's scored by Yamaoka, and it's also more memorable than his work in later titles like Silent Hill 4. I love the intro music, but also the calm guitar riffs in the beginning when you are just walking with Heather through the normal shopping center. It's really relaxing and starts you off nice and chill before things go to crap. The actual intro of the game has you start in a nightmare, where you are visiting the amusement park close to Silent Hill, and the game immediately throws you in the deep end. Where even Silent Hill 1 took its time with introducing an enemy in their version of the nightmare, in Silent Hill 3 you immediately get a dog and some big arm looking dude to come after you as soon as you open the first door. You either need to get to a certain point in this nightmare or die, and then you will wake up in the mall in a burger joint. Soon a mysterious detective will try and interview you, but Heather, smart girl as she is, doesn't trust it and vows to go home to her dad. I do have to say that I really love the design and character of the detective, but his voice acting was probably the worst in the game. The voice acting is a lot better in this game compared to Silent Hill 2. Heather's voice is great. Donna Burke this time does a better job as Claudia, though that's also because Claudia does not need a whole lot of emotion. It still seeps through that she's not the best at voice acting when Claudia gets upset because of her father. Vincent's voice is great, and overall, the presentation and voices just are better done. The detective is the only one with some very weak deliveries early on, but again, I do really like his character and design, so I'm not hating on that.
Claudia? What about her? She asked me to find you, that's all.
So you are one of them.
Claudia did all that? Look, I was just hired to find you. I'm not on anybody's side. I don't know anything about this.
It will not take long before you run into your first horrific monster in the shopping mall, and then you will get to explore different hallways and rooms and get your typical Silent Hill gameplay of checking all the doors and see which ones are locked and which ones aren't. The overall scale of this game is a lot larger compared to the earlier two games, with now way more open hallways and grand vistas like the wide shopping mall complex, the openness of the amusement park, or the empty subway station. Though the game still utilizes old school tank controls, animations have been improved upon and it all feels a lot smoother. The best improvement yet is the better and more fluid animation for combat, making that a bit more manageable and less frustrating. The good thing though, is that despite improving upon the combat and how it feels, it's not like Heather is a one-man army, and many of the enemies are still so aggressive and intimidating that you more often than not will run away instead of fight. The enemy design this time is pretty great again, and though I love the clear imagery and metaphors that the enemies from Silent Hill 1 and 2 stood for, it's not sometimes as clear to me with Silent Hill 3. Opinions kind of differ on the themes that Silent Hill 3 addresses, with some fans arguing that a large chunk talks about childbirth or having something growing inside you, thus also even making references to something like cancer, especially since one of the enemies literally has the word cancer in its name. Comparing something like having a child grow inside you with the fear of a tumor growing inside you is very dark, but there might actually be people that see a similarity if they have a child growing in them which they did not want to have out of free will. A large part of the game talks about how Heather's supposed to birth God, and later on she can even be seen grabbing at her stomach multiple times. With another enemy type, you can see that someone is being carried by someone else, which could also be interpreted as burning someone, but to me it was not all as clear that it had to do with the birth and all of that. In my opinion, there was also a lot of religious undertones, even way more so than with the story of the cult from Silent Hill 1. There's not only a lot of background lore and history on the cult and its beliefs, but also, for example, stories of how other religions took the base of this cult's beliefs and altered it. Now again, since technically it's Heather's doing that creates Silent Hill and she's not interested in the cult, it would indeed explain why the enemies do not seem to have any influence or thematic aspects with religion. But to say that having something grow inside you and childbirth being the only or main focus points is not exactly true in my opinion. In that regard, it should also be said that Silent Hill 3 is not as story heavy as Silent Hill 2, for example. I do have to say that I find this a bit of a shame, but I know that there are those fans too who think Silent Hill 2 is a bit too slow or not enough is happening. For those who want more of a gameplay Silent Hill experience, Silent Hill 3 has your back. Especially in the first 2 or 3 locations, there is a surprising lack of cutscenes, story, and character interaction. It kinda had me surprised and thinking, where is this even going? It isn't until you return home that the plot thickens and we get way more interesting character interactions, motivations, and background story. Halfway through the game, it is revealed that Heather is in fact the daughter of Harry Mason, the main character from the first game. At the end of Silent Hill 1, Alessa, a woman who was mutilated and tortured by a cult in Silent Hill, is being used to summon God so it can create paradise and eternal salvation for the cult members. When Harry Mason stops this, Alessa offers him a baby, which is basically her essence. It sounds a bit complex or complicated or kinda out there, but basically the baby and Alessa are the same, and Heather is that baby, meaning she has both memories from when Alessa was young, but also her own upbringing by Harry after they left Silent Hill. Because Heather technically is still Alessa, the cult is coming after her in order to have her birth God, so they can still succeed in their plan to have paradise take shape. In the background story and lore, you pick up from the cult that it tells the story of how men could only fight and suffered for generations until an offering was made to the sun in the form of a snake and reed, and out of sadness God was born, who gave the people what they wanted. This notion that from suffering God was born also gets applied to Heather by the cult, which is why they freaking kill Harry Mason. The main character from the first Silent Hill game is dead in part 3. It's really sad and a well-acted scene when Heather finds her dad, and this motivates her to go to Silent Hill to stop the cult and kill their cult leader Claudia, who directly is responsible for the death of her father. And that is basically the gist of the story. So it comes down to that Heather is the reincarnation of the woman who was able to birth God, and now a cult wants her to do it again by making her suffer, and she comes after them for revenge. The end. Again, for me personally, I prefer the super in-depth and dark subject matter of Silent Hill 2, but the presentation of Silent Hill 3 with its characters and locations is top-notch, and the tempo is always high, so despite it being less story-focused, it did not lessen the enjoyment by much. I was always invested and wanted to know what was around the next corner. What's interesting too with the monsters is that at one point a character named Vincent is fascinated that Heather refers to them as monsters, meaning in reality they might not actually be monsters but real people intending to hurt her. In my opinion, that intent on hurting her stems from that premise of increasing Heather's suffering, as from the suffering, mercy is born. Especially with more human-like enemies like the missionaries, it can be quite likely that these are just actual people or cult members coming after her with a knife, because you never see anyone else of the cult besides Claudia despite reading about more members. Yeah, luckily Silent Hill 3 is not without its deeper layers, which I'm still very happy that it has these. I should also say that there is some very funny and clever self-humor in here as well. Early on in the shopping mall, you come across a toilet, which has something stuck in it. You have the option to pick it up, and when Heather tries to do this, she actually stops and says to herself, "Ugh, this is disgusting. Who would do this?" Obviously, referring to James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2, who, without asking questions, sinks his entire arm in a stinky, overflown toilet to pick something out of it. So now that we have talked about the story and themes, let's dive a little deeper in its gameplay, but also how scary it is, because in my opinion, it's way scarier than Silent Hill 2 and is actually the scariest out of all the 4 first Silent Hill games. So as I said, it still handles that classic Silent Hill formula of going down hallways and checking doors to see which ones you can and cannot enter. Despite the locations being more massive than ever, the fact that you can always enter only a small amount of rooms makes it to where you can oversee where you might have to go if you get stuck. Despite me maybe taking a few minutes to think where I needed to go, I never got stuck to the point where I had to look something up, and the tempo always keeps you going and pushing you onward. The weakest part of the game, in my opinion, is the subway section, though luckily it's not very long. It's just that the halls and the tunnels are not that atmospheric, and you still will mostly be fighting standard enemies like the dogs, which are the least interesting. There's a short section on an actual subway, which is neat and introduces you to one of the new, really grotesque looking monsters, but all in all, this section offers the weakest in terms of environment, puzzles, and story. Then you can get to the apartment complex, which is great as it introduces you to some very frightening and aggressive new enemies, but also has some very awesome and logical puzzles. It should be said that the puzzles and riddles in Silent Hill 3 are absolutely wonderful once again, and for some reason it was very intuitive for me in terms of all of the solutions, which granted, sometimes is actually a bit weird on what you are required to do. For example, there's a section where you walk over a bridge with water and a monster in that water always insta-kills you and drags you under. If you head into a different direction, you find a hairdryer at a certain point, and I don't know why, but I immediately made the connection between hairdryer and electrocuting yourself. Again, I don't know why, but that image of frying yourself in the bathroom in the bathtub while drying your hair apparently was something that immediately came to my mind. Same with the device you find in the apartment, which is often used to lift up cars or other heavy objects. I then came across an elevator that is slightly open, and just by looking at it I knew, I need to use this item on that. Following that, it says you cannot climb down once you've opened the doors, but by that time you should have also found a screwdriver, and make note of a slightly open drawer which you cannot further open by hand. If you use the screwdriver on the drawer, which makes sense, it gives you a rope, and of course it's intuitive enough to where you get to use that to climb down the elevator shaft. I will say that sometimes it's not as logical as what you do or are required to do, like collecting blood in a see-through bag or using a coat hanger to pull down a ladder. But as I said, it was intuitive and logical enough for me personally to where I completed the entire game and all of its puzzles without looking up a guide once. It's much better and clearer than something like Silent Hill 4, where sometimes you have so many rooms you have to visit, and if you're required to get one specific item, it really becomes searching for a needle in a haystack as you re-enter each and every room, which there are sometimes more than 20 of, which gets annoying and boring really quickly. The riddles are also fantastic, like the code in the hospital with describing each of the 4 numbers in a cryptic way, or the final puzzle where you need to collect tarot cards and it tells you where to place them with a story, much in the way Silent Hill 2 does with the 3 coins. I just love this riddle solving, and it's honestly a puzzle mechanic that I wish more games in general would use and adhere to, since it's so much better and engaging than find a switch or key in order to proceed. After the apartment section, you finally head to Silent Hill, and we'll revisit the Silent Hill 2 hospital, and so you get some fan service for the fans of that game. Honestly, it was very cool to revisit the familiar streets, and I even went into the strip joint that Maria worked at and found an Easter egg mentioning her, and it feels like a twisted coming home party for fans of the second part. You really get the feeling like, I've walked here before with James, or that's where we saw Laura on the wall, etc. It earns the fact that certain areas are reused from an earlier game without feeling cheap. It should also be said that in the hospital, you of course will face off against nurses again, and though their looks are not as unique or threatening as their Silent Hill 2 counterpart, their accompanied music definitely is. Holy smokes, is their music, when you come near them, menacing and scary. It really makes me feel uneasy and wants me to get rid of them just so I can stop that awful music. They are also faster than the nurses from 2, and overall just a pretty big threat. Silent Hill 3 also has multiple rooms throughout its campaign that are straight up troll rooms, where once you enter, you find yourself in a very small room with 3 or sometimes even 4 dangerous enemies. It's the literal representation of, nope, screw this, I'm out of here. And I've checked some of these rooms after saving, and since there are sometimes no items at all, they are indeed purely just there to troll you. Also in the hospital, one of the creepiest and scariest storylines gets revealed that is absolutely brilliant and freaked me out so much with the creators doing so little. Soon after entering, you will find a note addressed to you from a patient and a weird, scary looking doll next to it. The writer of the note, Stanley Coleman, states in the note that he loves Heather more than anything and that he has waited for this day all his life. That's a little weird, but whatever. So you open a few more doors and rooms, and soon you will find another note with that same doll next to it. It's a note from Stanley again, and he talks about how he was offended that you did not pick up the doll, that you did not accept his gift. Just reading this and even thinking about this again while writing this literally is giving me goosebumps. I have never witnessed in a game that just text freaked me out so much. It was as if Stanley was watching me and commenting on what I did in real time. For the first time in a game, I felt like I was being watched while going through the hospital and feared the time when I would come across another note from Stanley. And you do indeed do, and every time that tiny scary doll is right next to it. Stanley gets more and more desperate the more notes you find, and eventually it does stop with the final note having the broken doll next to it. I will say that the ending of those notes could have been a bit stronger with, for example, Stanley threatening you and you then really freaking out or being creeped out because you think someone is coming for you, but overall it just really impressed me so much that this section was so scary to me purely by the words written down by the creator. It might actually be the first time that I got freaked out by just text, and it's a true testament of how good the notes and writing is in this game. It can wholeheartedly stand amongst the great writing in Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 1. 2 games with great writing, but terrible voice acting. Go figure. I honestly also miss horror like this in games we know nowadays, where they are genuinely about creeping you out and giving you goosebumps without using the jump scare so many games nowadays use. The same can be, for example, said by the sound design in Silent Hill 3. The sound design is so much scarier than part 1 and 2, and they're able to send shivers down your spine purely with the sound. One part that really stuck out to me near the end is where you find a fallen over wheelchair with the wheels still spinning. The spinning is making a horrible sound as it slows down and dies out, and just that image and sound alone once again made me have goosebumps, and let me tell you, I'm not the one who gets freaked out or goosebumps easily by a game. Silent Hill 2 nor 4 freaked me out nearly as much, and it was purely by design and not jump scares that this game got to me. Really impressive. Now I should say that Silent Hill 3 does have some jump scares, and more so than the other games as well. But they are once again done very well. One memorable scare is in a storage room full of mannequins. I hate dolls and mannequins, so that's always a good way to get me freaked out, but you find all of these mannequin bodies without heads, except one in the middle of the room that still has its heads attached to it. Nothing seems wrong with it, but when you want to head to the door to leave, suddenly you hear a loud female scream, and when you go back to the center of that room, you see that the head has been chopped off the mannequin's body and blood is coming out of it. Nothing else happens, no monster comes out, but it's just that visual and scare alone that had me going, screw this, I'm out of here. Then there's also a brief but very memorable part in the amusement park, where you enter a haunted mansion and they do some very clever and cheap, albeit appropriate for the setting, jump scares. You are going through various rooms as the announcer tells the gruesome stories of people being murdered and hanged or chopped into pieces as loud noises and puppets scare you. One scare that really got to me was where you walk and a real dead body that is hanged suddenly falls from the ceiling right in front of you. The camera angle shifts, and one of the reasons why this scare was so effective was because in the same room there's a big chair with a scary looking puppet on it, and so I was focused on that puppet, which meant that the body coming out of nowhere really got to me since I was not focused on that area of the screen. It also ends with a pretty scary and simple chase as the haunted mansion comes after you with this threatening red glow as the announcer says that they are not letting you go. Just overall really well done on the scares and creepiness of this game, a true horror game in its purest form. And so by now we have come to the end of the video, and I would like to say that I still prefer Silent Hill 2 over this with its deep themes, tone, and story, but it is noteworthy to state that Silent Hill 3 actually does surpass Silent Hill 2 on certain aspects. It's prettier than Silent Hill 2, it's scarier than Silent Hill 2, and has more fluid and better fighting controls, though combat in general is still not that impressive. It lacks a bit in the story department, and the voice acting is not top notch for all the characters, but in all honesty, you are going to have a really good time with this game through and through. It's a more active roller coaster ride than Silent Hill 2, and some of the scares, characters, and environment really will stick with you. In the end, Silent Hill 3 gets a 9. It's just a little bit less than Silent Hill 2 for me, but still very much recommend a title for any horror fan out there. Now with the completion of the Silent Hill 3 review, of course next up is the review of Silent Hill 4. And I have to admit that by the time of writing this review, I have already played and completed Silent Hill 4. And it is also here where I stop, unfortunately, being very nice and complimentary of the games in this series, and one can expect the next review of Silent Hill 4 to have a lot more anger and disappointment headed towards it. So I hope to see you all again for another scary review when I meet you all in the room.